I'd like to talk to you about a serious issue here at home in New York State. 67% of the women currently incarcerated are survivors of gender violence. In my work as a Tow Policy Advocacy Fellow for Sanctuary for Families, I worked alongside their Incarcerated Gender-Based Violence Survivors Initiative. The initiative's goal is to obtain parole and clemency for survivors of gender violence with the assistance of legal, clinical, and social professionals who are doing this work for free because they are passionate about what they do. In my work, I learned that the criminal justice system in our state has failed survivors multiple times. We fail survivors when we dispatch law enforcement to respond to incidents of violence and don't help them. We fail survivors when they go before the New York State Parole Board and are not granted release. And lastly, we fail survivors when we don't provide them adequate preparation to go before the parole board and explain why they've been incarcerated in the first place. First, the criminal justice system fails incarcerated survivors when law enforcement is dispatched to respond to incidents of domestic violence. In cases like Leah would call the police and ask for help from her abuser, who was abusing her sexually, psychologically, verbally, and physically. Once law enforcement arrives on the scene, they take the abuser and the woman who put in the call and separate them to gather their stories. 9 times out of 10, law enforcement would ask the abuser to take a walk around the block or to cool off. The abusers are not arrested. They're left with the woman who put in the complaint about abuse in the first place. As a result of the lack of law enforcement intervention, women like Leah find themselves in situations where they have to defend themselves and no longer put up with their abuse and kill their abusers. They're convicted of felonies and incarcerated across the state. And finally, the services that are offered by the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision are minimal. While incarcerated, women face an additional problem with the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision. This problem is in the services that the department is offering survivors to obtain release. We know that to an extent, the Department of Corrections offers services in vocational training, educational training, things of this nature for people who are actually incarcerated. There's evidence that survivors of gender violence have actually obtained associate's degrees, bachelor's degrees, and even law degrees while incarcerated. However, there is no form of preparation for survivors to prepare to go before the New York State Parole Board to adequately advocate for themselves, describe why it is that they landed there in the first place, how the abuse that they endured for most of their life landed them in the crime that they committed and incarcerated. So how do we fix this? We would ask the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision to consider implementing a program or a workshop that would help prepare specifically survivors of gender violence to adequately advocate for themselves before the New York State Parole Board. Such a workshop would include professionals like those of the members of the Incarcerated Gender Violence Survivors Initiative that are legal, clinical, and social professionals that have experience in helping survivors of gender violence in the work that they do across state agencies and nonprofit organizations. Incarcerated survivors like Leah need to be able to adequately go before the New York State Parole Board and explain to the parole board, who may not be knowledgeable about things like gender violence, explain to them how gender violence they endured throughout their lifetime, throughout their childhood, has actually impacted the crime that they are incarcerated for. With the current passing of the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, there might be hope for women to obtain release aside from parole. The women that are currently eligible for parole might be eligible for resentencing, and as a result, be able to obtain release from being incarcerated much quicker than the parole process. To take action, I encourage you to contact and visit Sanctuary for Families' website to learn more about the impact that the criminal justice system has on incarcerated survivors and to learn more about how you can help bring them home.